Sustain267.
Welcome to the Sustain267 feature, where we talk about climate change, the environment, and sustainability in Botswana on Yarona FM. My name is Patokilisitse. Still on the theme of elections, as we're currently registering for the general elections in Botswana until the 5th of February, today we're talking political will. Specifically, politicians' will to act on climate change. We'll be sharing a snippet of a conversation we had with Happy Kambule in 2020 during the worst of the COVID-19 pandemic. If you remember, at the beginning of 2020, there were no government regulations around COVID-19 or even a budget in any African country. And within almost a blink of an eye, in Botswana specifically, we had regulations that cost millions to put in place. And who would have thought that governments could move so quickly and so efficiently? Most of these measures at any other time would have been political suicide, to say the least. Yet the government put in place these regulations around COVID-19 because of the pandemic. But now, crossing over to climate change. Unlike COVID-19, it's a slower process, but it requires dramatic, swift action from our leaders. And COVID-19 showed us what government and government policies and our political leaders are capable of when it comes to addressing an impending crisis. Today, we're in conversation with Happy Kambule, and the first question I asked him was, is there a will from our politically elected African leaders on climate change?
To be honest, there isn't real political will to address climate change or the climate emergency, or in this case, as we're starting to articulate it as the climate crisis. And the reason for one to believe that there isn't one and one to understand that there isn't one, meaning the political will, is that first and foremost, it's not that it's not present, it's just not there in the necessary way that we need it to be. And what that means is if there's political will to undertake a particular action, and a good example is the response to COVID-19, hard decisions are made and very difficult decisions are made. And the population who's subject to those decisions tend to understand the reasoning as well as the extent to which the decision is important and necessary. Whereas with the climate crisis or climate change, the greater proportions of the population are starting to understand that there is a thing called climate change and that big decisions need to be made. But the political class and the elites that we live under and live with just don't want to make those decisions because it still serves them in order to keep things as they are. So the political will to address climate change is not necessarily there, although one might argue that it is probably growing.
So if it's a thing of addressing this, fine currently might not serve the political elite. Unfortunately, they're the ones, to some degree, we could say, who have the power to change it. How do we then motivate the political will in them?
We as society tend to invest the authority to make decisions and invest our power in those who are the political elite or the political class. And what they tend to do is they manifest what we want as a key issue, and they undertake those necessary steps, processes in order to achieve that. So part of it may be, and this is what civil society around the world has been trying to do, is to say, maybe it's not just the politicians and the bureaucrats that need to be heightened and shown that this thing is a real problem, but also just society. The more society starts to show discontent, the more society starts to speak about the problem, and the more society wants answers, that's when the will and the necessary need to address those questions is manifested through political will.
As we come to a close, Happy, ideally, in a perfect world, if we could have political will, what would it look like? We talk of not having enough political will, but if it was there, what is this thing that we are looking for? What would it look like? What would it manifest as around climate change and action?
See, the thing I think which is important for a sense of action by politicians, but also manifesting the will of the people, which would be the political will in this case, it's really that we are able to do as people, as the information that is sound and that is scientific in this case, that is verifiable, needs us to do. And that means in some cases, and I guess in our case, Botswana, South Africa, and largely the African continent, is that the democratic spaces that have been created, or the opening of democratic spaces, needs to be there. So we need to safeguard certain things. The ability to voice, participate, associate, and do as it is required by not only science, but for the greater good is one. The second part is really that there is a sense of accountability for inaction.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. This is a feature from a longer conversation that was published on Sustain267 Podcast in June 2020. Find the full episode available on your preferred podcast platform and listen to the Political Will on Climate Change episode. I am the host of Sustain267, Patokilisite. Let's connect on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter on our handle at Sustain267 and continue the conversation. Again, a reminder to register to vote, because that is the ticket you will need to motivate political will for what is important to you as a young person and as a Motswana. Take care.
Sustain267.